All right, let's talk about school. The title for this one is School on the Assembly Line, and for a pretty good reason. We're about to pull back the curtain on the hidden blueprint for how we all learn, and trust me, the truth is, well, it's a lot more surprising and honestly a bit unsettling than you'd probably guess.
Okay, let me ask you something. Have you ever been sitting in class? You hear that bell ring, you pack up your stuff, you move to the next room for the next subject, and you just get this weird feeling. You know, like you're on some kind of production line, where the real goal isn't so much about learning as it is about just processing you through the system, nice and orderly.
Well, if you've ever felt that way, I'm here to tell you, you're not wrong. Not at all. That feeling, it's like a ghost in the machine of our entire education system. But the story of why it feels that way? Oh, it goes way deeper and gets a lot darker than you might think. We all assume it's about preparing us for jobs, right? But the original design, it had a much, much more chilling purpose.
And this is where it just gets wild. I mean, look at this. The parallels between a factory and a school they're just uncanny. The assembly line, that's our classrooms, all sorted by age. The time clock punching you in and out, that's the school bell telling you when to move. The foreman watching over everything, yep, that's the principal. And quality control, making sure every product is the same, you guessed it, that's standardized testing. It's all built on the very same idea: efficiency, standardization, and control.
So this all leads to one really obvious question, right? If our schools are basically factories for kids, who designed them? Who were the industrialists, the Henry Fords of education that came up with this whole system?
And here is the first big twist, because the answer isn't what you think. The blueprint for this whole thing, it wasn't dreamed up by some captain of industry in an American factory. No, the real origin story, it starts somewhere else entirely, and for a reason that had absolutely nothing to do with industry.
See, the timeline really tells the tale here. Way back in the early 1800s, you have the Prussian state creating this model. Then, in the mid-1800s, it gets imported over to the US. And only after that, in the early 1900s, do American industrialists get their hands on it and start optimizing it. So the factory part, that wasn't the blueprint, it was just the final coat of paint.
Okay, so let's rewind and go right to the beginning. Let's talk about this Prussian blueprint, because here's the kicker. This system, at its core, was never designed for industry. It was designed for one thing: obedience.
So, picture this. It's the early 1800s, and Prussia just got absolutely crushed by Napoleon on the battlefield. Total humiliation. The leaders get together and try to figure out what went wrong. And their conclusion is, frankly, it's stunning. They decide their soldiers lost because they were thinking for themselves too much. They were too independent. So what was their solution? A complete, radical redesign of their entire society. And they decided to start with the schools.
And the goals they set were crystal clear, and they had nothing to do with creating innovators or thinkers. It was all about cranking out compliant servants and obedient soldiers. The whole point was to stamp out independent thought and to build this unshakable loyalty to the state. The endgame? National uniformity. A whole country of people who thought the same, spoke the same, and acted the same.
And wow, the machine they built to do this was something else. It was this rigid, three-tiered system that basically sorted kids into their life path from the moment they walked in the door. So at the very top, you've got this tiny elite. We're talking less than 1%. They were taught to be the policymakers, the leaders. Then you have the next level down, maybe 5 to 7% of kids. They were trained to be the professionals, the engineers, doctors, lawyers. And for everybody else, the other 90+%, they were sent to the people's schools, the Volksschulen, which had one single solitary purpose: to teach obedience.
And if that doesn't sound dystopian enough, get this. In those schools for the masses, they actually limited how much the kids were taught to read. Why? Because, and this is a direct quote, reading produced dissatisfaction. Can you believe that? The thinking was that if you read too much, you might get ideas about a better life, and that was considered dangerous for a population that was supposed to just be soldiers and factory workers.
So the big question is, how on earth did a system like this, a system built for an authoritarian state, end up becoming the model for schools in a democracy like the United States? Well, let's follow the breadcrumbs across the Atlantic. Okay, so the key player here is a guy named Horace Mann. He's often called the father of the American public school. So back in the 1840s, American schools were kind of all over the place. Very local, very decentralized. Mann wanted to fix that. He takes a trip to Europe and he sees the Prussian system in action. And he is just completely blown away by its efficiency. You know, professional teachers, a state-controlled curriculum, everything was so orderly.
And he basically said, that's it. That's what we need.
Now, obviously, you can't go back to America and say, hey, I found this amazing system for creating obedient citizens. That's not going to fly in a country built on liberty. So he had to sell it. And he did it by wrapping the Prussian structure in this beautiful, inspiring language of democracy. He called it the Great Equalizer. He promised that it would give every kid a fair shot and keep America from becoming like class-ridden Europe. And honestly, it was a brilliant piece of marketing.
But here's the thing. There was a huge gap between the promise and the reality. The promise, the sales pitch, was all about equality and uplifting everyone. But the reality of putting a top-down, standardized system into place, it became about social control. It was used to assimilate huge waves of immigrants, to kind of stamp out cultural differences, and to push a very specific set of middle-class, Protestant values on everyone. The very structure of the system started to work against the democratic ideals it was supposed to support.
All right, so that brings us to the final layer of this whole story. We've got the Prussian model as the skeleton. We've got Horace Mann's democratic sales pitch as the skin. But it was the big American industrialists of the early 20th century who really came in and perfected this machine for the factory floor.
So around the turn of the 20th century, there was this new philosophy that just took over American industry. It was called scientific management, or Taylorism. And the core idea was super simple. Treat everything and everyone like a part in a machine. You break down every single job into its smallest parts, you standardize how it's done, you measure everything, and you eliminate anything considered waste. And you know what waste usually meant? Individuality, creativity, anything that deviated from the standard.
So what happened next? Well, a new wave of educational reformers, many of them funded by these same industrialists, looked at Taylorism and said, let's do that to our schools. So they started treating the job of being a student as something to be scientifically managed. The curriculum and textbooks, standardized. Quality control, that's where standardized testing really took off. And things like creativity, curiosity, taking a different path, that was all considered waste, inefficiency that needed to be eliminated from the system.
And they weren't shy about it either. Their goals were totally explicit. Just listen to this quote from a report funded by a John D. Rockefeller organization. It says the goal of schools is to organize our children and teach them to do in a perfect way the things their fathers and mothers are doing in an imperfect way. I mean, just let that sink in. It wasn't about creating thinkers or innovators. It was about training a more efficient, more obedient workforce to just slot right into the existing social machine.
And all of that brings us to right now, to today, because we're living with the legacy of this whole complicated history, and it's left us with a massive dilemma in the 21st century.
Think about it. So many of the education reforms we hear about today, the ones with this obsessive focus on high-stakes testing, a lot of experts call this the new Taylorism. It's basically the same old scientific management idea, just in a modern package. And what does it do? It forces schools to teach to the test, narrowing down everything they do to only what can be easily measured with a bubble sheet.
And this, right here, is the fundamental problem. The system we've inherited is built from the ground up to value standardization and compliance, but the world we actually live in today, it needs the exact opposite.
I mean, what does our world demand now? It demands critical thinking. It demands people who can adapt on the fly. It demands creativity, collaboration, the ability to learn your whole life. And the irony is just staggering. These are the very skills that the old model was explicitly designed to suppress, not to grow.
So, at the end of the day, here's where we are. We're trying to run a 21st century world on an educational operating system that was designed for 19th century obedience and 20th century factory efficiency. So the big fundamental question we all have to face is this. How do we stop just tinkering around the edges of this old, outdated machine and start designing and building something totally new? Something that's actually built for the world we live in now, a world that runs on innovation.